We can start then. So good morning and welcome everyone to today's webinar, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism Overview. So it's about CBAM. It will be a very interesting one. My name is Malin Janovu, and I'm the Business Development Manager for International Trade at the Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce. And if you never heard about Thames Valley Chamber of Commerce, we are the accredited chamber covering Berkshire, South Buckinghamshire, Oxfordshire, Swindon, and Heathrow. So from Heathrow down to Swindon and up to Banbury, we are covering this region. Before we start, I would just like to tell you that today's session will be recorded and you will receive a copy. You won't see your faces, or if you are asking any questions, I won't say your name, so everything should be right. Also, the recording will be available on our webpage, thamesvalleychamber.co.uk. If you have any questions, please send them using the Q&A facility, and we will try to cover all of them live. But in the eventuality that we are not able to due to the timing, we will definitely send you an email and we will answer your questions. So let me show you my face. This is me. You can see me in the real life too. And I want to tell you a bit more about CBAM. On 1st of October, the European 2023, of course, the European Union's Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism entered into application in its transitional phase. The European Commission have outlined the EU CBAM that the EU CBAM will initially apply to imports of certain goods like iron and steel, aluminium, cement, fertilizer, electricity, and hydrogen. And I'm not the expert in this, so allow me to introduce you to William Bain, our distinguished speaker for the upcoming CBAM overview webinar. William is the head of trade policy at the British Chambers of Commerce. Probably a lot of you already know him. With his extensive expertise in trade policy, he will explain to us the key top-level requirements for producer companies outside the European Union, ensuring compliance with the new CBAM rules for their goods exports to the European Union. His insight will be invaluable for protecting sales to the European Union customers and navigating the complexities of CBAM. So let me tell you a bit more about William. So William worked for the last 7 years with a range of companies from global retailers to small and medium companies, advising on EU exit, the protocol, Northern Ireland, also the UK's new trade investments policies. Previously, William spent over 10 years as an academic lawyer specializing in constitutional and EU law, and 5.5 years as an MP, including roles as Shadow Minister for DEFRA, Transport and Scotland, and membership of Business Innovation and Skills Select Committee. So if it's about an expert in this field, William is the expert. Our trade policy guru today, William Bain.
Oh, thank you so much indeed, Mal, and very kind introduction. And hello to everyone dialing in or watching this on demand. I think it's really timely that we're having this webinar today about the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism and this wider phenomenon we're seeing across the world about how to regulate and deal with the commitments that our governments have made at various COPs, the Paris Agreement and subsequent agreements to implement that, and the way that that's now beginning to sort of come down into parts of industrial policy, tax policy, and regulatory policy. And I know that over the last 6 months, this has been an area that businesses have been engaging hugely with Thames Valley and other chambers up and down the country. And it's something that we've been liaising with nationally very strongly with both the UK government and also the European Commission. And if we move on to the next slide, we can perhaps just begin to define what CBAM is. I mean, it's an acronym that's sort of entered the business discourse. Even in its longer form, it's still quite a clunky expression, a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So where does this idea really come from? Well, following the adoption of the Paris Agreement, there began some discussions at EU level, in the US government as well, about the best way to prevent something called carbon leakage. And this is really the scenario whereby companies, whilst remaining within the terms of the Paris Accord, in terms of domestic production and movement towards net zero, so decarbonizing production here, as it were, still opt to offshore part of their production to countries which have not adopted as yet the kind of onerous net zero transition rules, which countries in Europe, in North America, and parts of Asia have already adopted. And so to prevent this, there's a range of techniques and policies that you can adopt. You can have, for example, a straight carbon tax, which some countries have looked at. The United States is one of those. You can look at having potentially a globally coordinated solution. Could perhaps be done through the OECD, but as yet that's not materialized into anything that's substantial. So a global option doesn't look like it's happening for the moment. You can hand out emission trading scheme allowances free, and try and manage carbon leakage in that way. You could use sanctions as a means to keep out goods that are produced in high carbon production markets. Or you can have, in a sense, a compromise, which is what this carbon border adjustment mechanism is. And in terms of how the EU has designed it, and at the moment, the EU is the main proponent of this means of regulating offshore emissions in the production of goods. The way that they have put this together is, as Malin said, in two phases. So we're in the initial transition phase, where it is possible for EU importers to get free ETS, emissions trading scheme permits. So they're given those by the European Commission for free. And the requirement on the importer of record, I mean, the primary, at the end of the day, this is an EU instrument, a regulation passed last year. So the primary obligation is on the importer of record within the European Union to make quarterly reports to the European Commission. This is a policy which is administered by DG Tax UD, which is the main tax directorate within the European Commission. So to make quarterly declarations about the embedded emissions which are contained within goods that they're importing. So this is why CBAM involves the EU importer of record having very detailed conversations with the supplier, in our case, the UK supplier, to ascertain what are the direct and indirect emissions embedded in the production of the good, which is moving from the UK to the European Union and being imported into the EU. So that is where we've seen, and it's the logical implementation of the regulation. That's where we've seen UK companies saying, goodness, what do we have to do in order to ensure our customers can comply? And the importance of this is that providing this information to your customer, the importer of record within the EU, is essential for the continuation, really, of your supply relationship to that customer. So it is now compulsory that for 6 categories of goods, including aluminium, iron, steel, fertilizers, hydrogen, and electricity production, that you as the producer of goods, and it's not simply iron and steel bars we're talking about. It can involve downstream applications of those goods. So, for example, a toy that has a sort of steel screw in it is something that comes within scope of CBAM because it contains that downstream usage of steel. So, the obligation at the moment is that you, as the exporter, provides the information to your customer, either business or consumer, and primarily this is at the moment affecting B2B transactions, and that importer of record within the EU therefore fills out the declaration. Now, in practice, what that's meant is that the EU made in last summer an implementing regulation and issued a very detailed guidance document for third country enterprises which are complying with the new CBAM. So effectively, there's a document which UK businesses then started to look at in conjunction with us in the Chambers network. And that provided the detail about what you had to record. And for things which involve usages of iron and steel, the obligations on recording are really quite onerous. So you have to record, for example, the kinds of gases that you might use in the steel production. You have to look at the electricity usage that's going into the steel production. So really, you can see, particularly with that commodity, that you're really looking at having very detailed attestations that you're having to supply to your client or customer within the EU. Attestations that almost involve, a sort of real involvement with the production process itself, such as the degree of information which is required. So what we have seen is quite a lot of companies looking to the Chambers network for support and how to meet these attestations, fill out the very detailed spreadsheets that are involved, particularly for goods with iron and steel in them. And that has provided some assistance for companies. But even so, what we were facing ahead of the first declaration period, which was from October 30th to January 30th this year, was a scenario whereby companies were saying, despite their best efforts, they were really going to struggle to fill out the sheets and provide all of the required information. And we communicated that to both the UK government, to the European Commission, and various easements have been adopted. So, for example, there was a 1 month delay brought in terms of the first reporting period. So effectively you had until the end of February. And then also it was made a bit clearer that, if there were some issues that companies were facing, providing the attestations to the importer of record in the EU, then, there would be measures taken to limit the impact of that. So companies were very worried that their goods would be stopped from going over to the EU. And so these easements, I think, have taken some of the teeth out of those worries and concerns. But nevertheless, we are seeing a considerable pickup in admin timing and costs required to fill out these attestations. But insofar as we are not included or linked to the EU emissions trading scheme, then these adjustment costs are nevertheless going to be inevitable. So this is really quite a considerable change, and we're just in the initial transition period. The regulation which the EU has passed comes into a definitive stage from January 2026. And in a period prior to that, what will happen within the EU is that the free certificates under the emissions trading scheme will then start to have a cost and a price to it. And that will be related to the EU's carbon pricing, which was introduced some period ago with the ETS. So free permits will be phased out. These will become tradable permits. They will have a cost. And of course, in January 2026, if goods, and there will be an extension beyond these 6 sectors of products into the vast majority of products which are contained within the scope of the EU emissions trading scheme. So there'll be a more comprehensive range of products that come within this, even beyond this initial six ranges. And what will happen from January 2026 is that a difference in the EU carbon price and that of a third country exporting market, like the UK, will have to be reflected in a cost paid to the European Commission. So from January 2026, there will be a fiscal consequence here. And that if there is a difference in the UK and EU carbon prices, and that will be reflected in the cost of purchasing the permits under the EU scheme, that financial difference will have to be paid to the European Commission. Now, the main, I think, significance of a CBAM is not as a sort of fiscal cash cow, as it were. It is meant to change the behavior of importers and to ensure that they're not importing products from markets where goods produced with high levels of carbon. And in terms of steel, we're talking about, Indian and Chinese steel, which has had up until now higher proportions of carbon in it than that which has been produced in Europe. Interesting to note that China itself gets the significance of this and is looking, albeit slowly, to techniques which can decarbonize its steel production. But the main aspect of CBAM is that behavior changing activity, and that is going to be its key effect. And we can already see the significant changes that are going on, because Turkey, for example, is now seeking to align its rules with that of the EU, because what it is recognizing is that it does not want to be in a position from January 2026 where its steel is subject to effectively an import tax as it goes into the European Union. So Turkey is looking at aligning its rules with those of the EU CBAM, so as to ensure the continued competitiveness of its steel exports and steel goods going into the EU. And essentially, this is something which all third countries are going to have to look at, because you either align with the EU scheme, which is the first in the world to introduce these requirements, or you have to say to your exporters, you're going to have to pay more to export into the EU market. And that is the essential decision that CBAM forces third countries to resolve. We also know that India is very keen on ensuring the competitiveness, particularly of its steel. And so it is looking at aligning with the EU scheme. So you can see that, de facto, outside of North America, those markets which really value the trade that they're doing with the EU are falling into line behind the way that the EU is dealing with carbon leakage and this issue of reporting and payments. And so if we go on to the next slide, please, Malin. We've had some developments in policy here in the UK now as well. where shortly before the March budget, the UK government made clear that following a consultation it had done last year, that it is planning to introduce its own CBAM in 2027. So that's a year after the EU scheme is enforced with its full definitive version. But nevertheless, that is an important step because it sort of signifies that, you know, what's begun in Brussels is now an approach to dealing with imports, which is going to apply in a much wider range of countries. It may well be that America does its own thing, but you can see that those countries in the European neighborhood and which trade the most with the EU are really going to be looking at ensuring the competitiveness of their exports. And what the government has said it will do now is to consult with business and industry on how to design and implement a UK CBAM. But we can expect it to be similar, an initial stage of where reporting is required by importers of record in the UK in terms of all exports and coming from the rest of the world, looking at what quantity of embedded emissions are within the product, and then eventually moving to a fiscal element. And it was interesting because in the budget last week, the government and indeed the Office for Budget Responsibility kind of started to score how much a UK CBAM might bring in. And it bears out the point I mentioned earlier, that this is not a sort of fiscal cash cow to bring in billions, you know, effectively from exporters. The total amount that they expect to realise from CBAM is only £170 million per annum. So you compare that to the vast revenues that national insurance and income tax bring in. So again, the key element of the UK CBAM is behaviour changing. It is saying, you know, you've got to make sure that if you're importing steel products or iron from markets where there is high carbon, you know what those embedded emissions are. And if there is high carbon, you're ensuring that those countries are beginning to change the way that they produce these commodities and to do it in a more carbon climate friendly way. So that I think is quite interesting in terms of those potential costings. However, what we've not had a decision on is whether the UK government would propose or seek to link the emissions trading scheme of the United Kingdom with that of the European Union. And obviously before Brexit and the end of the transition period, our two schemes were linked. There was a single carbon price. That has begun to diverge a little bit in some commodities since January 2021. But we're obviously very aware that Switzerland, again, a non-EU state, reached an agreement with Brussels whereby they didn't merge the two schemes, but they linked the emissions trading scheme of Switzerland with that of the EU. And countries which have this linkage, therefore, don't have to face the issue of the fiscal element in terms of their exports into the EU. So what the BCC, in terms of looking at this issue and speaking with the Chambers Network last year, resolved in terms of our position and have communicated to both the European Commission and to the UK government, is that we believe there should be a linkage of the UK and EU ETS. That means, you know, it removes any requirement for any trade barrier, fiscal or regulatory, between the UK and the EU. The practical consequence of linkage would be that we would not require to fill out the attestations, and we would not be on the hook at any point for any fiscal barrier, any payments in terms of CBAM. So we think this is the best way to ensure that our exports to the EU are competitive and as friction-free as possible, removes a great deal of the red tape around this that we see at the moment. And also would have the practical benefit in terms of investment across the European neighbourhood in clean energy and climate technology and green hydrogen and decarbonised electricity, all the good things that are driving economic growth, but also keeping to our Paris COP carbon commitments. And the ETS linkage is the best way to achieve that and keep costs down for business. And we hope that in the process in the end of 2025, going into 2026, when there is a operational review of the UK-EU Trade and Cooperation Agreement, how it's working, that this issue of ETS linkage will be addressed and we can start to have negotiated a linkage mechanism that is the best outcome, really, in order to keep costs as low for exporters as possible. But until that happens, we have to comply with the CBAM regulation in terms of what it states for the UK at the moment. So there are considerable costs. There's no question of that. The best advice that we can give is that your Chamber of Commerce has, the expertise, the guidance, the way to get into government to raise concerns. If there are easements which are needed, the network can very quickly communicate that to government, and we can reach solutions that will work in businesses' interests. I know this is it seems almost a sort of different language and different world to look at this particular issue, but it is one of the most important trade barriers that we could face in terms of exporting goods to the European Union. So it's important that within your company there's knowledge of this. If you're in an affected sector right now, or potentially looking at being an affected sector as the scheme expands as we get towards 2026, that you understand the guidance that's been produced by the European Commission. You work with your local chamber in terms of the compliance issues around that. And also you look at who within your firm will be, in a sense, the CBAM lead if you are an exporter to the EU. And what we're finding thus far is it's typically sort of customs leads who are taking this role on. But if you're involved in very extensive production, perhaps of products with steel within them, then it's so intrinsic to the actual good you're producing that it might require more than just having your customs lead on this. It might really need to be almost embedded within production, that you're making sure that there are responsible people within the firm for ensuring that in terms of goods with steel, that some of the very onerous requirements and data collection is embedded within your production techniques, so that you're able fully to meet what's required in terms of gas usage, electricity usage within steel products in particular. So I hope that's been a useful introduction. Really looking forward to the questions and feedback. This is an area I know we'll want to come back to as the different stages come as we move towards full phase in 2026. And importantly, as we seek to influence how the UK may introduce its own CBAM later in the decade as well.
It was very interesting, and I've got some questions that will clarify some ideas for our watchers, the people that are watching us. I know that you covered about a few of them, but I just want to clarify them. Why is it important for the UK traders to get interested in the topic of CBAM right now? what are the main reasons why they should be very aware about what's happening?
Very good question, Malin. The primary reason is if we want to maintain our market share with our customers in the European Union, they are required when they're importing from a third country, as the UK is now, to produce these attestations. They have to get that from their supplier in the UK. So basically, if you want to have the trade, then at this point, without that ETS linkage we talked about, then we are required to produce the evidence about how much embedded emissions are in the products that we're seeking to sell into the European market. So it's essential, really, it's compulsory in order to keep our market share for the products with our EU customers.
Thank you. That this is easier for me to understand now too. I've got another genuine question. Will this apply to all products? Like, for example, decorative home items or toys? Why not?
So at the moment, it just applies in those 6 sectors. That is going to expand as we move towards January 2026. So the latest from the Commission is that they expect at least half, and perhaps a good proportion more than that, of products which come within the scope of the EU's emissions trading scheme to be within scope of CBAM by January 2026. So for the moment, toys, yeah, because they are a downstream usage of steel or iron within them. Sort of home furniture improvement goods at the moment, probably not, because they're not going to, if they don't contain iron, steel, or aluminium. So at this stage, certain products are in scope. Certain products will come into scope as we move towards January 2026, and we will update you as and when the position changes in terms of what's coming out from the European Union, and we keep in very close contact with both the Commission directly and also the EU Embassy in London, who are aware of our strong interest in this.
Thank you. Got another one that is also very interesting. This is how I see it. So we know that the supply chain is quite complex. Is this CBAM specifically for producers only? And what is about distributors? How are they concerned about it?
So the answer to that is no, it is not just an issue for producers. If you are a small retailer who's selling a good to a client or customer within the EU, you're equally as bound to provide that customer with details about the embedded emissions in your goods as someone who is a direct producer. In a sense, if you think about it, the key responsibility, the legal responsibility in the EU system is on the EU importer, your customer. But of course, your customer has to get that information about those goods from you because you are the merchant. And whether or not you're the producer or not, you will be required to have that in order to keep that business. So it's much wider than simply an obligation upon producers.
This is perfect. You already answered one extra question. Who is responsible for paying the CBAM tax, which is the importer in European Union? So we asked for this one. And is there a template that we need to submit with our export invoices to declare the CBAM?
Yes. So there is we asked this from the European Commission. So they've produced a document alongside their implementing reg, which is really designed for third country companies in each of the 6 affected sectors at the moment to be able to look at and think about. There are set spreadsheets which are designed to be filled in for each of the sectors. And those are linked to in that guidance and document as well. So if you are in one of those sectors which is in scope, then do contact Malin, and he will be able to provide you with a copy of that guidance from the Commission, and also the link to the spreadsheets for the declaration. Now, what we have found already is that companies did find it quite awkward to use. And that's why we had to ask for those easements that, people had to calculate, for example, how much electricity they were using in a product. And one of the things that we said to Brussels was, well, this can be a bit awkward and onerous. Are there any sort of default values that if you can't provide an attestation for how much electricity is embedded in the production of this good, there's at least some default values we can put in, which would apply. And last month, the EU produced a whole set of default values as well, which should ease some of the compliance issues. So if you physically can't measure the amount of a particular gas that's been involved in your steel production, or you can't measure how much electricity was involved, then the default values can be put in. And that will, I think, ease some of the compliance issues. But this is a moving target, this thing about CBAM compliance. It's not just a sort of, it happened in October, and it's not going to change until January 2026. There will be developments that happen over the next couple of years, and that's why it's important that you stay in touch with your local chamber, let them guide you through this, because they will get that insight from ourselves and from Brussels in terms of any easements or any changes that happen over the next couple of years, and make sure you're well prepared in advance for when those changes will come in.
Thank you. That's very, very interesting. Question from me to you. Can you share those sheets with me, so I'm sure that I have the information straight from the source, and I'll send it to all the attendees today?
Yes, absolutely.
That's perfect. So we answered somebody's question, because somebody asked us if you can share that. I've got another one that I think I know the answer for this one. How would this work with DDP shipments where the exporter is essentially also the importer in the European Union, but may not physically be established there? That means European Union. Do they have to rely on an established third party to submit their data, and would such third parties be willing to do this given the potential risk under the indirect representation?
Yeah, very, very interesting scenario that. I mean, look, at the end of the day, who is it who has the bulk of the compliance cost here? It is us as the company in the UK who wants to sell our goods into the EU. So I think really if you have a DDP relationship and you effectively are the importer of record, yes, you're taking on that legal responsibility to make the declaration, but the de facto making of the declaration is really being done, by UK companies anyway. So in terms of the practical consequences, they're no different. But legally, if you are going to be the importer of record as well, then you do have that additional legal responsibility, and that might be something you just want to let your insurers know about.
It is right now selling DDP goods to European Union. It is a struggle for a lot of companies, because you need a tax representative there, and you need to be VAT registered in a certain country in European Union. So it is a bit complex for DDP. What we said to our customers and members for years, please understand the implications of a DDP. And if it's possible, we always advise to simplify everything and do a DAP and negotiate those implications with your customers. Because that might, right now you have an extra barrier on top of the VAT issue that DDP it's raising. So thank you for that one. We still have a lot of questions, and let me see which one will be a very short one. Are there any exemptions within the current categories for certain types of industries? Are there exemptions?
Nope. I mean, the nature of this is to have as comprehensive a coverage as possible within those sectors which are in scope. What we're kind of waiting for from Brussels is, in a sense, how they're going to extend the scope beyond this initial 6 sectors. So will they identify 6 to 10 more, have those come in maybe in 2025? Or is it going to be a sort of big bang approach where everything else that they plan to extend it to within the EU emissions trading scheme comes in 2026? So that we're sort of waiting for more developments on. And it'd be interesting to get the views of UK business and what they think would be the best approach. You know, at the end of the day, it's an autonomous decision for the EU, but nevertheless, to get the views of UK business, I think will be important. We'll be looking to do that over the next few months. There is some sort of, I mean, there are recent regulatory developments in Brussels where, for example, there was a corporate responsibility due diligence draft directive, which was meant to be going through quite quickly this year. And the German government said, no, business costs are too high at the moment. I want to have a rethink in this. And that regulation has been pulled. And unlikely it's coming back until after the European elections. So there may be a case where, you know, if the feedback from within the EU is that more time is needed, that some of these deadlines might be pushed back. So, you know, at the moment they're saying no change, full implementation by January 2026, but it could be pushed back a bit. But will there be changes on the general principles of this scheme? Absolutely not. There is strong backing for that, really across the EU. So there might be a bit of flex with the timing, but I don't see there being any flex with the principles or the fiscal charge element, which is to come in as well.
Thank you. I've got one that I'm sure that you will like it at least as much as I do. So we know that United Kingdom is the second largest exporter of services in the world. Now, my question is, can a consultancy company formed in United Kingdom act as representative of the CBAM declarant filling CBAM report? I think our
yeah, I mean, we're seeing this already, Malin. That you know, there are companies which are headquartered and registered in the UK which are providing services. You know, there are chambers up and down the country which are providing training, for example, to help with compliance. So yes, there's absolutely no problem with a UK registered company providing services to help companies comply with this new regulatory burden. There's no restriction on that at all.
Thank you. If the UK, this is a very interesting one. This is policy mostly. If the UK develops an analogous CBAM regime, for example, doesn't have less onerous rules or on embedded carbon emissions in goods, will there be a way of negotiating away the need for UK suppliers to comply? I'm not sure if I understand very well the question. So are we...
I kind of do, yes. So, I mean, it comes back to this issue of linkage. Ultimately, you know, the impacts will be asymmetric here because the EU carbon price is unlikely to fall below the UK carbon price. It's functioning of the market and the commodities we're talking about here. So in the sense of purely from the regulatory and fiscal elements, it will always impact more on UK exporters than it will do on EU exporters to the UK. So really the best argument to make from the UK perspective, but being very mindful about the need to retain the competitiveness of our exports and to avoid unnecessary charges and do what we can to mitigate or even eliminate these new regulatory burdens. The best way is to look at that issue of linkage of the two emissions trading schemes. That's the kind of dealing with this at source, the way the Swiss have done. So if you have the linkage of the schemes, you have the same carbon price. What that means is that you don't have to fill in the paperwork and you don't have to, you're not on the hook for any fiscal elements or charges from 2026. And that's what Switzerland has done successfully. It took a while to negotiate with the EU, but those negotiations began when Switzerland didn't itself have a carbon pricing system, which we, of course, in the UK do. So that really is the way of dealing with this at source, because otherwise, as you say, we will end up with additional import paperwork in terms of our biggest market. In terms of a UK CBAM, of course, those countries maybe outside the European neighborhood who don't wish to link with the UK or EU ETS, importers in the UK will have that responsibility of ensuring that those attestations are there. And again, if there are any sort of goods coming from high carbon producing markets, and there is a difference in the carbon price, there will be that fiscal element to it as well. So it could become a bit more costly to import goods, let's say from outside the EU, depending on the design of how a UK CBAM is introduced. The government has said they will consult with business and industry this year to go through many of these points. So again, when that consultation begins, we'll be speaking in detail to the chambers. We will ensure that those documents come down to yourselves, and your input, I think, is going to be important, how a UK model is designed and will impact upon importers here.
Thank you. I've got two more questions that are quite similar. We know that supply chains those days, they are very, very complex. And both of the questions are saying that our UK entity, they are manufacturing here their products. They are bringing aluminium or iron or parts, just parts or raw material, but in small amounts or even large amounts from USA or other third countries. Their struggle is that they cannot get from their suppliers of raw materials the information they need. Practically, how can they do that? To ask for the information or?
Yeah. So the main means of doing this is through the sort of mill certificates. So really you're looking for from your supplier of the steel or iron, the mill certificate where the steel was produced. Now, what companies have said to us is, oh, that's awfully difficult to do. We don't necessarily get that from our parts down our supply chain. How are we going to deal with this? So again, there are some sort of ways to deal with this in terms of the default values. That provides one alternative if you cannot get the milk certificate from your initial supplier. But at this stage, it is probably best to try and say to your suppliers, we really do need that milk certificate. Not just for CBAM reasons, but also for reasons of complying with the EU sanctions in relation to Russia and Belarus.
Yes.
Because again, you really do need the milk certificate for the steel in order to fully comply with those sanctions issues. And that's another matter which the Chambers Network has been raising with the UK government and the Commission over the autumn of last year and this winter as well.
Thank you, William. Yes, yes. It is quite complex, the world of raw materials, metal in special. I've got another one that is beyond my understanding because I don't know what an EPD and an LCA is. Do you know what those are? So the question is, does the Chamber of Commerce recommend that British manufacturers invest in measuring embedded carbon, like for example, EPDs and LCAs? I'm not sure you've...
The regulation is not prescriptive in terms of how you measure. So the way things are working at the moment is if you have schemes, if it's a good that you're perhaps importing and then substantially transforming here and then exporting into the EU, then the sense is that having things like the mill certificate, having details about any embedded emissions is very, very useful. But look, at the end of the day, if it's not possible to have that supply chain information, then you can use the default values in your declaration. And that might be a more straightforward scheme than, I think, embarking upon investing in new products to help you comply. By all means, if it is going to be cost effective for you in the long term, you can think about these, and there's certainly ways to provide that data. But it might be, in the short term at least, more practical simply to use the default values in your declaration and see how that goes. It may work, that may be a longer term solution that might work for you, or you may feel you want to invest in these other techniques. The regulation is non-prescriptive about that. But remember that if compliance is proving awfully costly in terms of actual measurement of the embedded emissions, the default values are there as a very good backup.
Yeah. The person that asked the question said that the mill certificates do not contain the information needed for CBAM because it's nothing about the carbon emissions information. And also, somebody's asking in completion, is there a time scale for how long we can use default values before the accurate attestation can be produced?
Well, I mean, the default values really, the intention is that, until 2026, and potentially these could be used thereafter as well. I mean, that's one of the issues about implementation that we would need to speak to the EU about. I think if there is a sense that default values are useful, I mean, they may become the de facto things that people input depending on the nature of the product, particularly around steel and iron. So it may well be that there's a fix that can be secured, which means that default values can be used beyond January 2026. It wouldn't seem too difficult for that to be done. I mean, at the end of the day, the EU is going to want to have a sort of relatively easy life on compliance as well. There are additional resource that the Commission's having to put into enforcing this, and it wants to make it as simple as possible for itself as well as for the importers of record and their customers outside the EU in order to comply. So I think these various little fixes could be done to ease that compliance. Yeah, I mean, around the mill certificate, it provides certain things, but certainly around things like electricity usage, etc., you would have to look to other documentation from people further down your supply chain. If that's not available, then again, that's another factor leaning you towards using the default values.
Yeah, some of the people that are watching us are saying that the default values will be until 31st of July this year, and somebody is saying that from 1st of January 2025 you will have to use the defined EU calculations. I'm not an expert in the field, but what I know is that everything is under review right now. Am I correct that things might change? So the best advice we can give is just to be aware of what's happening.
Absolutely, Malin. And what we're doing as a Chambers Network is monitoring very carefully and speaking with the EU about how this is going to develop and roll out. So we're passing information to them on behalf of business. And as soon as we have any sort of change in any deadlines or further clarity in deadlines, how and when it's going to expand beyond the original 6 sectors into those other sectors that it will expand into by January 2026, we will be in touch with you. As I say, this is a kind of movable process rather than a sort of big bang set of single compliance changes. And we will be with you on all steps of that journey as we move towards the definitive application of this EU CBAM.
Thank you. And I think this will be the last question. Are the declarations consolidated by the EU importer? For example, it's one EU importer, but the goods are coming from 5 different UK exporters. Is there only one declaration that will be done, or there will be 5 of them?
Best practice to do 5 of them, but ultimately it's an issue for the importer. The key obligation commercially in terms of a UK business is to make sure that you've complied with what is required in terms of filling out the spreadsheet in terms of your side of it. Whether they, as an importer, seek to combine it into one single return or 5 separate returns will be an issue for them. But as long as the UK exporter is able to complete the spreadsheet for the sector that they're trading in, then you've complied with commercially what is your part of the bargain.
Thank you very much, William. Thank you. This was very informative. What I would suggest to the people that are watching us, for specific questions, just send them to us and we will be more than happy to guide you through to the correct answer. Thank you, William. It was a pleasure to do this with you.
Melon.
I would like to tell the people about our next events. The next one will be on 21st of March, funded aid business opportunities. And this will be with our colleagues from the other chambers that are participant in this group. And I bet that it will be something very, very interesting. The next one will be on 9th of April, custom special procedures, save money and stay compliant. A lot of inquiries that we received those days are about special procedures. So trust me, you will want to see this. Laurie, my colleague, will chair it. And the one on 18th of April, are supplier declarations sufficient to provide proof for origin of the goods? And this is another issue that we see our customers and members have, and it's related to preferential origin and proof for preferential origin. So please join us for those events. And you have here information about how to contact us, please send us your emails and we'll be more than happy to help you. I promise that I'll send you, if not today, tomorrow, I'll send you a copy of this presentation together with the link to review it if you wish so, and also with the information from William with the example. Thank you very much and have a lovely day. Thank you very much, William, too. Thank you.